Ever stood under a sky so wide, your secrets felt small? Here, on the world of cowboy stories, we ride the stories of the West, campfire, truths, trail dust, memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. Summer 1884, New Mexico Territory. The mesa burned the color of iron at dusk. Wind combed the grass flat and carried heat in slow, heavy breaths across the flats north of San Isidro. Caleb Rourke eased his sorrel to a walk when he saw the first dark bloom on the dirt. Blood a coin-sized circle sunk into red dust. Not his. Fresh. He slid from the saddle and crouched. The stain was bright at the edges, tacky in the center. A second drop showed farther on, and then a smear where someone had stumbled. The windmills on the horizon clicked and groaned. Overhead, a telegraph wire sang a high, thin note like a mosquito you could not swat. The horse flicked an ear. Caleb put a hand on its neck and looked ahead. She stood in the open field, barefoot dress, torn to the knee, hair matted with dust and the sweat of running. One hand hung useless at her side. The other held a rounded stone-black basalt from the dry creek bed. She lifted it as if it weighed nothing. "Do not touch me," she said. It came out raw, scraped by thirst, sharp enough to cut. Caleb kept his hands in view. He set his hat on the saddle horn so she could see his head empty. "All right," he said. "I am over here." Her eyes moved quick from him to the horse, to the empty horizon, to the far mesa where heat made the air shiver. The pupils were pinpoints in the blaze. There was a cut along her thigh, an ugly bright slice, and tracks of dirt on her cheeks where tears had dried and been covered again with dust. He smelled blood and sunburn and old leather. A hawk cried thin and mean, and then a grasshopper came humming up from under his boot and buzzed away. "Name is Caleb," he said, voice low. "I got water." She flinched like the word itself had teeth. The stone lifted higher, no closer. Her mouth trembled and set. "If you put hands on me, I will die." "Understood." He moved a step sideways, not forward, into the shadow of the horse. The sorrel nosed at scrub mesquite and snorted. He watched her feet. The soles were cut and dirty. He watched the way she held herself ready to bolt and already spent. There is a feel to cattle that will break away. They keep their eyes on a fence as if it were a mouth. This had that feel only human. A breath passed, then another. The telegraph hum rose and fell. Somewhere far east, a rider crested a far ridge and vanished again, or it was only the heat making shapes. Caleb did not turn his head to follow it. "Your leg needs wrapping," he said. "I can leave the canteen on the ground." Her fingers tightened on the stone until her knuckles went chalk white. The rest of her shook. The summer light made her bruises violet. She took one step back. Another. The rock dipped a fraction. Fear made a sound in her throat too small for the open land. He set the canteen down anyway, then stepped away from it and raised both hands again. "It is yours," he said. Her eyes flicked to the canteen, then up to him, then to the river line far off a brush seam where willow and cottonwood scratched the sky. The rock trembled. She took another step back, keel dragging a line through dust. Then she turned and ran. Caleb did not call after her. He lifted the reins and started the sorrel on a slow walk, parallel to her angle, far enough not to crowd her. She moved like someone who had already spent what was left, and had dipped into something else, the body's hard last reserve. Every dozen strides, her hand came up to her ribs as if to hold them still and keep the breath in. The ground sloped toward the Pecos, more blood drops, smaller now. Then a smear across a patch of goat head, and a print where she had gone to a knee. He kept his eye on the lay of the land where the grass thinned, where rocks rose like black teeth. Budwing crickets clicked. The horse's shadow stretched and shook on the dirt. At a wash of sand, he found the canteen. She had not taken it. He picked it up and slid it back on the saddle horn. He could taste dust on his tongue, taste iron, taste heat. The river announced itself with smell before sound, a cool green wet under the baked air. Cottonwood leaves flashed dull silver where the wind found them. The Pecos lay low in its bedbanks, caved where spring floods had bitten them, water showing brown and clear in different light like the back of a fish. Reed stalks rubbed together and made a tiny music. She reached the cottonwoods and faltered. The stone fell from her hand and hit root and rolled to a stop. She took 2 steps into the shallows and went down on her hands. The water took the dust off her wrists and left pale skin under it. Then her arms shook and gave, and she folded to her side. She did not rise. Caleb dismounted. He looped the reins around a drooping limb and moved slow boots in the water. He came at her from where she could see him. He spoke her a warning before he was within reach. "I am going to take your arm." She did not answer. Her chest rose and fell fast and shallow. He saw the flutter at the throat that says pulse, but not strong. He took her wrist gently and turned it to find a stronger beat. Skin hot. The cut on her thigh had oozed down to her calf. Mud had painted the skin into a single dark glove. He wet his bandana, passed it over her mouth to moisten her lips, then her forehead. Her lashes flickered and settled again. He washed his hands in the river, cooled them long, and then slid them under her shoulders in a way that made the least contact he could manage. She flinched even in faintness. He paused, let her body learn the weight of his hands, and then lifted. She was light like all people are when they have not eaten. The kind of light that still drags at you because of what you are carrying besides bone. He stood, and water ran off the hem of his coat and off her hair in thin streams. He set her on the grass in shade and took a better look at the cut. It had grit in it. He would have to pull that out and bind it quick. "Hold on," he said, more for himself than for her. He ripped a strip from the tail of his shirt. He drew the cut clean with river water, picking out tiny black flecks of basalt and dirt with the point of his pocket knife. Her body bucked once at the sting and went slack again. He pressed the strip over it and tied it snug with a second piece of cloth, checked for fresh seep. Blood came, then slowed. Wind lifted hair from her temple and set it down again. In the backwater, a frog croaked 3 times like a clock. He thought of May, not the way she died, not the way the sound of boots on the porch had changed for months after, but of her hands folding a cloth the way they made edges meet. He reached into his pocket and touched the slick face of an old silver dollar. It was worn smooth in the center where his thumb had worried it. He left it where it was and did not look at it. He slid his arms under the woman again and stood. The sorrel nickered low, a question and a promise together. Caleb answered out loud, a habit from too many days where no one else did. "We are going home." He set her across the saddle lengthwise so her leg would not tear again. He looped a lead rope under her shoulders and tied it gentle to the horn so she would not slide. He tested the knot. The horse shifted and then stood steady. He took the canteen down and trickled a little water into her mouth. She swallowed without waking. He put the canteen back and checked the sky. The sun leaned toward the mesa. Heat still climbed off the dirt, but a soft breath had sprung up from the river. Along the bluff, a ribbon of light flashed a shard bright and gone there and gone again. The mind offers simple answers first. It could be quartz. It could be glass left by a tinker's wagon. He studied it 1 heartbeat longer, then let it be. On the rise above the trees, the telegraph wire gave that thin tone again, the wire singing to itself, the country talking through copper over places where no one stood. He picked up the reins and clucked to the horse. They moved out of the shade and into the open crossing through grass that came to the gelding's knee grass, brown at the tips and green below if you reached down into it. Dust caught at his boots and lifted, climbed his cuffs, worked into the skin at his wrist where his glove left a line. Red dust had a way of living on you, a way of making its home. He did not try to brush it off. The horse stepped sure. The woman on the saddle made small sounds, breath sounds. He kept one hand up near her shoulder, without touching ready if she slipped, and let the other guide the reins toward Palo Rojo, where the cabin sat with its roof of rusted tin and its door that stuck when the air got too hot. A jackrabbit ran ahead long ears back and angled away. Coyotes would be looking for shade in a draw until night. The windmill on the south pasture turned and creaked. When he came up out of the river bottom, the land opened flat and wide, and the sun put long slats of light through cottonwood limbs. He could smell the cabin even from here, a blend of coffee grounds and dry wood and dust that never quite leaves. He spoke to the shape of her on the saddle without looking at her face. "You are safe," he said. "I will keep my distance." He did not know if she could hear him. He said it anyway. He said it plain so there would be a record of it in the air. He walked on horse in step with him, the wire humming high above the pecos behind them, sliding over stones, the mesa ahead, holding on to the heat, the way iron holds fire. The roof of rusted tin clicked as it cooled. Caleb set his shoulder to the swollen door and worked it open on a breath of stale heat and coffee. He led the sorrel to the hitch by the porch, eased the woman down with a rope cradle under her arms, and carried her inside in a way that kept her at arm's length. The room held the day's warmth, like a kiln. Light came through the gaps in the boards in bright blades. Dust hung in that light and turned slow. He laid her on the narrow bed, slid a folded quilt beneath her head, and stepped back until his boots found the seam where the floor changed color. The canteen was on the table already. He set a tin cup beside it and filled it a quarter. He put the cup within reach and backed away again. The windmill on the south lot turned, creaked once, and fell quiet. A telegraph wire sang its thin note out beyond the cottonwoods. The horse snorted a muffled sound. Then the small cabin went still except for the tick of cooling stove iron. She woke with a short sound in her throat, the kind of sound a person makes when they rise fast out of a deep place. Her eyes found the ceiling, then the window, then him. Her hand went to the edge of the blanket, clutched it tight. She saw the cup. She saw the door. Her breath came quick and then steadied. "You are in my house," he said. "Palo Rojo, you were about to go under." Her voice was dry. "You touched me, just enough to keep you breathing." He spoke from where he was. He did not move closer. "I will stay back." She lifted on an elbow. The movement pulled at the bandage on her thigh and put a line across her face. She stopped there halfway up and looked at the things nearest her. A shelf with 2 dented lanterns, globe glass kept clean. 3 squat cans of kerosene under it, because the pump had been stubborn all month. A broom with the bristles worn to a fan. The corner of a small table smooth with use. On a nail above the table hung a wood carving of a horse whittled from mesquite, rough but careful. The letters M and R were cut into one side. She took the cup, sipped. The water hit her stomach and set off a shiver. She waited until it settled and took another. "Thank you," she said. The words came out like she had not used them in a long while. He nodded. "There is more there. Take your time." Her gaze moved across him the way a person marks a distance in their head. He had left his hat on the chair. His hair lay flat with sweat along his scalp. His sleeves were rolled, forearms scratched from fence wire. She looked back to the shelf. "Whose initials?" "My wife," he said. The room held it a moment, not heavy, just full. May Rourke. She made that horse one winter when it rained 3 days straight and the river forgot its banks. She looked at the carving again and then away. "I am Lila." Her hand touched the bandage at her thigh and came away with a little pink. "Lila Hart." "Caleb Rourke," he said. "You can tell me what you want to tell me or not at all. I will see about coffee." He moved to the stove and worked to the damper to coax what heat was left. He poured grounds in the pot and a pinch of salt. The smell rose bitter and good. He set 2 cups out and only filled 1. He left the other upside down. She tried to sit. Her calf muscle jumped and nodded and let go. She swung her feet off the bed and stood halfway before her leg buckled. He reached, stopped himself in the space between, and held out the broom handle instead. She took it and found her balance with it. He stepped back another pace. "Bathroom." She looked toward a back door. "Out the back. There is a basin on the stoop, shade most of the day." She waited, and he went to the front door and pushed it wide so the light made a path. He stayed there and looked out over the yard while she moved slow along the wall, through the back out to the stoop. He heard the pump handle rattle, heard her set it down when it did not give. He heard water from the barrel splash into the basin instead, then the sound of cloth meeting skin. He poured her a little coffee and cut it with water. When she came back, he put the cup where the first had sat. She stood by the bed and looked at it. "Smells like a campfire." "It will do." She tried a mouthful. The heat pulled a tear from the corner of her eye that was not about any memory. She blinked it away and blew on the rim. The coffee steadied her hands. She set the cup down and looked at her feet. The soles were cut and full of dirt. He took a wooden box from under the bed and set it on the table, opened it so she could see what was inside. Clean cloth, a small jar of lard, a needle and thread, a bottle with a hand label that said spirits. He spoke in the same even voice. "I would like to clean those and do the leg proper. I will tell you what I am about to do before I do it. If you want me to stop, you say it." She stood very still. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and set her heel on the chair and folded the skirt back to the bandage. "Do not come close unless I am looking at you." "All right." He washed his hands at the basin he had brought inside, wiped them on a clean rag, and knelt where she could see his face. He took the old strip off and worked river grit out of the cut with the cleanest cloth he had. He spoke what he was doing. He did not fill the room with talk. When the pain climbed, she stared at the whittled horse. The letters in it steadied, then blurred, then steadied again. He threaded the needle and took 2 quick stitches where the cut gaped worst. Her jaw clenched. She let out air through her nose and did not move. He wrapped the thigh with fresh cloth and tied it firm enough to hold. He touched nothing he did not have to touch. He rose without stepping into her space. "You will want real food," he said. "Beans, bread, a little salt pork." She nodded once. "Set it there." Her voice had more in it now. "I can reach." He put the plate on the table and stepped onto the porch. He sat on the top step with his back to the post and let the sun work its way down the yard while she ate. The chickens scratched at the bare patch under the rain barrel. Back in the cottonwoods, a woodpecker tested the dead limb of a tree and found it hollow. The wire out on the road hummed its thin song and went quiet. When he came back in, the cup was empty, and the plate had a smear of beans and a heel of bread left. She had set the broom handle against the wall, where she could take it up again. Her eyes looked less like glass. They looked like they belonged to someone awake. "I will sleep a little," she said. "You do that." He took his hat and put it on. "I will see to the colt and the fence post that is leaning. Door will stay open. If you need me, say it. If you need quiet, I can give you that." She watched him go, and watched the rectangle of light near the threshold grow longer. The room held the sound of his boots on the porch, then the softer rhythm of his steps in yard dust, then the rattle of a bucket at the pump. She lay back and pulled the quilt up to her ribs and let the coffee sit warm in her stomach. Her fingers found the hem of the bandage and checked it without lifting it. On the shelf, the lanterns stood side by side, glass-clean wicks trimmed. The 3 kerosene cans sat dark and full beneath. A light breeze pressed at the open door, and the flame of the stove flickered and died, then caught again. The little horse on the nail swung once, a small arc, and came to rest. Outside, the windmill found the wind and turned. The house breathed with it. The day went on. Late light poured through the doorway in long, pale bars. The room had cooled a notch. Lila slept and woke and listened before she moved. She could hear the horse blowing soft in the yard. She heard a single nail in the roof click as the heat bled out of it. Somewhere a chicken muttered. The house felt steady in her ribs. She pushed the quilt down and sat up slow. The bandage tugged. She breathed through the tug and set her feet to the floor. The wood was warm and smooth with age. She reached for the broom handle and stood. The cup and plate on the table were empty now. The lamp glass on the shelf held the last of the sun like a caught coin. Outside, Caleb's hammer thudded twice and stopped. She went to the door and found him near the fence line, a post between his knees, the auger tossed aside. He looked up and tipped his chin. He put a hand at the top of the post and tested it. It held. He wiped his palm on his thigh and turned his head toward the south pasture. The cattle were wrong. They drifted, and then they did not drift. They bunched tight for no clear reason, heads up, tails flicking. Then the bunch unraveled and ran. Dust lifted off their hides and hung like breath made out of earth. The sound came a beat later, the hollow drumming of hooves, the short cough of a steer. The wind carried the smell of hot hide and fear. Caleb set the hammer in the dirt. He lifted the rifle from where it leaned in the shade and spoke in a voice that did not hurry. "Back inside. Use the wall as a friend." Lila looked past him to the far edge where the scrub broke thin. 3 riders showed in and out of brush-cutting arcs like painters who knew the trick of it. Dust coats, hats pulled low. They moved the way men move when they have done a thing often enough to make it look easy. One turned toward the bunched cattle and laughed. The sound did not carry clean, only the shape of it. Her mouth dried in a breath. The name rose without her consent. Crane Outfit. Caleb did not ask. He slid a cartridge into the gate with a practiced thumb and let the lever fall. The metal had a clean, oiled sound. He turned his body to give his rifle the right shoulder. His face was quiet. His eyes had the look of a man who takes the measure of a job and is already inside the work. "They took me," she said. The words were small and exact. "I ran." He nodded once. His jaw flexed. It was not the first time his mouth had set that way. He glanced at the open yard, at the path that led from the gate to the porch, at the cut of the ground near the barn, where a man could put a knee behind a feed barrel and find cover if cover was required. Then he moved. The yard changed in his hands. A sack of flour came from the pantry, and dust fell from its seams. He walked to the porch and poured a thin white line across the boards, where boot heels tend to touch. He dusted the ground in a little square in dirt, where the shade would hold the print. He hooked his thumb under the lip of a water trough and levered it twice to slide it a handspan for a better angle. He opened the barn and took an old iron trap from a peg. It had the shape of a jaw and a heart. He checked the spring with a stick and set it shallow under straw to the left of the wide door, then marked the safe place for his own boots with a short twig. Lila watched the riders come as far as the pasture fence and tilt away again. They were testing. She could not hear words, but she could read shoulders. The one in the middle rode loose and tall. A pale scar curved on his cheek, bright even at this distance when his head came just right to the sun. The sight of that pale line pulled something cold up her spine, like water up a well rope. She took a breath and found the bed again, only long enough to pull the small pistol from under the quilt where she had hidden it when he carried her in. She checked the cylinder felt for each notch and closed it with the care of a person who has learned to live with tools. She tucked the skirt up past her knee and tied it there with a twist of cloth so it would not grab. She slid the pistol into the waistband and took the shotgun where it stood behind the door. She limped to the threshold and stopped. Caleb saw the set of her shoulders. He did not ask for the pistol, and he did not tell her to sit. He tilted his head toward the barn. Shade in there. Good sight lines through the slats. Keep clear of the left of the door. I set iron there. If you cannot use your leg for a kick, use the butt. Her mouth pulled into a line that would have been a smile in another life. I know how to make a man fall down. He did not smile back. He went to the stove and took 2 lamps down and set them on the table. He wiped their chimneys with a clean rag like a habit he could not break. He checked the wicks and put them aside. His hand drifted to his pocket and touched the silver dollar and left it there. They moved together without stepping over the edges they had named. She took the barn's right wall and found her place in the lattice of shadow and light. Dust floated in the beams and made a fine veil. The smell of old hay lifted sweet and dry, layered with mouse and leather and the faint edge of oil. The feed barrels made a low barricade if you crouched. She chose to kneel high enough to shoot and low enough to be small. From the doorway, she could see the south pasture and the line of mesquite where the riders had last crossed. The fence cut the land in patient squares. A grasshopper hung on the rail hind legs, cocked body, humming. Her breath moved inside her ribs again. Not fast now, not slow, just there. Caleb stood outside in the raw light and watched the margin where the riders had gone. He raised the rifle and laid the barrel along the corner post to steady it. He did not fire. He watched the dust they left hang and thin and drop. He listened. He let the land offer its own news. "Tell me what you know," he said without turning. "The middle man is Silas Crane." She spoke the name like she pitched it into a ditch. "He wears his scar open to the sun. He likes to circle a place and make it listen to him. They keep to dry draws until the last breath, and then they come fast and loud. There were more than 3 on the trail. I could hear them when I ran. They like a woman frightened, because frightened is quiet." He let the words sit next to the sound of the yard. "All right." She swallowed. The coffee had left a taste on her tongue that made her think of campfires and burned sugar. She cleared it and felt her throat open. She set the butt of the shotgun firm to the floor and laid the barrel along the gap between 2 boards. She watched the slice of sky and the slice of grass and the slice of the fence and nothing else. Her leg throbbed where the stitches sat. She counted her breaths until the pulse in her thigh pulled less. On the mesa, a small flash winked in and out like a fish turning underwater. It could have been glass. It could have been a rock face catching light. Caleb saw it and let it lie for now, the way a man lets a thorn lie until he has 2 hands free. The cattle calmed. One lowed and another answered. The wind came out of the east with a fresh edge to it that had moved over water. Behind the barn, the windmill clicked and began to turn. Shadows pulled longer across the yard. A fly found the corner of her eye, and she did not lift a hand to move it on. Caleb stepped to the porch and opened the flour sack again. He pinched a bit between finger and thumb and dusted it over the footprints he and Lila had already made so he could read new ones when they came. He set the sack down open as if he had grown careless. He checked the sight on the rifle and his other hand checked the pistol at his hip without asking permission. Lila felt the room. The wall against her shoulder was warm. The slat at her cheek had a splinter that brushed her skin and did not catch. A feather drifted in the barn's light and spun until it settled near her boot. She picked it up and then put it down again. Her palms were dry. She could taste river on the inside of her lip where she had bitten it. "Caleb," she said quiet. He stepped where she could see him, without looking away from the pasture. "Yes. If I fall, you do not touch me until I say. All right. If you fall, I will not leave." He took that in and nodded. His face did not move much, but a line that had been tight near his eye softened. He took the hat from his head and hung it on the nail by the door. The carving of the horse swung an inch and found center again. The wire on the road sang once and held its breath. The yard waited the way the land waits when it knows the next thing will not be slow. The yard held its breath and then let it go. Hooves sounded beyond the fence, not rushed, not slow, a steady 3-beat that said men who like to be heard. The cattle pushed to one side of the pasture and showed their ribs. Dust climbed and hung in a soft brown cloud. A voice came across the open with a kind of lazy cheer. "Bring the girl out, rancher. You can keep the horse if you behave." Caleb did not answer. He set his shoulder to the porch post and brought the rifle up cheek to stock eyes even with the sight. The butt fit the mark it had made in his shirt from other days. He breathed once and held the breath in a place that did not shake the barrel. The rider on the left edged closer, testing. Caleb put a bullet in the dirt 6 inches from the gelding's forehoof. Dust jumped. The horse danced a step and checked itself. The shot echoed once off the barn wall and went thin. Lila felt the sound through the boards. She shifted the shotgun along the gap in the slats until the pasture cut into view again. The riders scattered across her slice of sight, then slid out of it. She listened for the next shape. Her hands were steady. The throb in her leg flattened to a dull heat. The barn smelled like hay that had learned to live with summer. A fly walked a slow circle on the feed barrel and lifted in the same place it started. "Easy," Caleb called, and the word traveled without hurry. "The fence does not belong to you, neither does what stands behind it." The middle rider pushed his hat back a finger and turned his head so the scar caught a lick of sun. He spun the reins and made a small shape with his mouth, something close to a smile, if a smile had no kindness in it. He eased his mare closer to the gate and put a hand out flat in a mock sort of peace. "You got poor memory, Rourke. We talk and then we take. Same as last time." Caleb's jaw set at the word last. He did not invite it in or push it away. He took one half step to the right enough to break the picture he would have made if someone had guessed him willing to stand still for a shot through a window. He watched the middle rider's hands. He watched the edges where men who like to circle find new ground. The one on the right nudged his mount along the fence and slipped toward the barn. He turned the horse's head to hide the angle. The animal blew out and tossed its ears and then settled. Lila saw the slice of a man's calf through the slats. The denim was dark where the leather of the saddle rubbed it smooth. He put a boot to the ground and left the horse to rest with the reins low. He kept to the wall with a hand along it, body thin, the way a man does who has learned to make himself into a shadow. She drew the breath she needed and let it out slow. She raised the shotgun until the bead found the place where the wall's shadow thickened at the left of the wide door. She did not lean out. She did not chase the picture. She waited for it to come to her. At the porch, Caleb shifted his aim to the middle rider, the one who watched everything without moving much. "Turn your animals," he said. "Put the dirt of San Isidro between us and you." The man's smile changed a hair. He lifted one shoulder, and the rider on the right broke for the barn door and came in low. His foot found straw and missed the shape under it. He took one more step left and put weight where Caleb had told the ground to bite. The iron trap came up with a clap like a hand brought down hard on a table. The teeth found boot leather and bone. The man went to his hands with a sound a man does not practice. The horse at the fence he had left behind flinched at his voice and set its feet wide. Lila did not look at the trap. She took the step that brought her a clearer line and fired once into what the slat gave her. The blast filled the barn and came back at her chest. The bead had been just ahead of where he would raise his head in pain. The shot caught him across the shoulder and spun him to the dirt. He clawed at the ground and threw one wild hand toward the trigger of the pistol at his hip. He found air. The iron at his ankle kept its hold. Outside, the left rider yanked his horse and sent 2 fast shots toward the porch. The first took a chip from the post and made it spit. The second cut air near Caleb's ear and said hello to the stovepipe behind him. Metal rang with a high note and then winced. Caleb did not duck. He did not like to duck. He slid the lever. Felt the spent shell jump past his cheek hot enough to mark him, found the front sight and put a bullet through the right rider's hat brim where it met his head. The man threw himself flat off the saddle and crawled for the thin shadow of the trough. The middle rider lifted his pistol and fired once a clean-timed shot that a man could use to take the top off a bottle or somebody's day. Caleb felt it pass. It took a shaving off the porch rail. He fired back and put splinters into the middle rider's pommel. The mare lathered and tried to swing out from under him. He sat deep and held her mouth until she remembered she could stand still. The barn filled with smoke that stung. Dust moved in it like fish under muddy water. Lila racked the shotgun and slid the second shell into the chamber. She tasted the metal of the trigger where her finger sat. A bullet came through the board at her shoulder and turned a knot into a flower. Splinters bit her skin. The lamp glass on the shelf near the door trembled against its wire holder and made a small sound. The wick flickered and found itself again. "Caleb," she said, calm, because calm was what she had to give. "I see him," he said. The man at the trough tried for angle. Caleb went down the porch steps slow enough not to lose his breath and crouched behind the barrel he had shifted earlier. He put the rifle on the rim and waited until he could see enough of a hat to make the rest of the head want to follow. He fired, and the hat left the man's hair in a flat, clean line. The man flinched and grabbed it without thinking and showed his temple. Caleb sent a second shot that shaved plaster off the hand draped on the trough lip and left skin behind with the plaster. That was enough. The man crabbed backward on knees and elbows, cussing at nothing he could shoot, dragging himself toward the mare he had left. He made a run for the stirrup and launched into it, crooked and wheeled away with dirt firing out from under the horse's hooves. The man in the trap had gone quiet except for breath. Blood ran into the straw in a thin line and made a shine there. Lila kept one eye on the door and one on the gap. She did not go to him. She did not put herself where a hand could find her ankle. She swept the barrel right and left in a slow arc and listened for the cue she needed. The middle rider saw the line of it and made a choice. He leaned, brought his pistol level, and sent a bullet across the yard that hummed past the open door at a height that would have taken a person if the person had been foolish enough to stand in it. Caleb stepped to his left and felt the passage on his right cheek like a moth's wing. He put a bullet into the man's stirrup leather just to tell him he was not alone. The leather cut and dropped. The mare jolted. The rider stuck to the saddle by his knees and pride. He raised his pistol again and then checked himself not out of mercy, just out of math. "Pick up your man," Caleb said. He spoke like a post that has held a gate for a long time and decided it would keep doing so. Silas Crane turned his head. The scar on his cheek looked like a fingernail mark made by a god who did not care. He looked at the blood in the straw. He looked at the trough and the hole in his own tack. His mouth drew thin and then eased. He signaled with 2 fingers to the left rider, the one who still had a hat. The man rode in close, bent at the waist, hooked his arm through the wounded man's collar, and hauled him clear of the door, where the trap lay, hungry, with no plan to let go. The iron jaw kept the boot. The man kept the foot. He screamed once and then went to a kind of silence that happens when a body decides noise will not help. Lila did not move while any of it happened. The barrel of the shotgun tracked the open like a clock hand. The scent of powder and old straw and the faint oil from the lamps made a mix that would live in her mouth for a while. Her hands shook once and then were still. The small pistol sat warm against her belly under the skirt she had tied up. Silas put 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, the way a man might greet a neighbor he did not respect. He turned his mare and left the way he had come, not hurried. The other rider followed, dragging his partner across the ground until he found the strength to pull him up to the horse's neck and hold him there with a forearm. Caleb watched them cross the fence line. He did not fire at their backs. He did not like to put a bullet in a spine when the spine was leaving. He lowered the rifle and listened until the hooves slid away into scrub and the dust lost its shape and became the air again. The cattle found their chewing and their tails began to switch in the old rhythm that means nothing hungry is inside the fence anymore. He went to the barn door and stopped a full step short of the place he had marked with the twig. He put the rifle down and took the stick up and used it to spring the trap from a safe lean. The iron jaw opened and stayed open. The boot it had held fell to the side with the dead weight of something that no longer had a job. He stepped around it and into the doorway. Lila kept the shotgun on her knee and the muzzle low. She did not raise her eyes to his face until he stood where she could see him without turning her head. Then she looked and held his look for one breath. He nodded once and looked away again on purpose. "You killed him," she said. Her voice had edges but no tremble. She looked at the stain in the straw. She did not look at the boot. "I did not plan it that way." His voice was quiet. "I said iron because men forget to look with their feet when they think a thing belongs to them. The rest was your shot." She let the words sit beside her. He was coming through the door. "You kept him from it." He picked up the lamp by the door and found it had a hairline crack in the chimney where the heat had jumped. He set it down with care. He looked at the ring the lamp had left on the shelf and then at the 3 kerosene cans lined under it. The room had all its things in their places and also had the new mark a bullet had made in the plank. The mark had a torn lip where a splinter had come away. He leaned the rifle where it would not fall and pulled a clean cloth from the box. He held it toward her with 2 fingers. "Your cheek is cut." She put the shotgun aside without letting it go entirely and took the cloth and pressed it to the place where the splinter had kissed her. The cloth came away with a little line of red and a bigger patch of dust. She wiped once more and stood. Her leg did not argue as much as it had. She tested the step and found it. In the yard, the flower line on the porch had a new pattern in it, the track of a man who had tried to move light. Caleb marked it with his eyes. He would be able to read how many and what shoes and who favored which leg. He did not need to do it now. He lifted the boot that the trap had taken and set it by the door like a thing that would have to be dealt with. He did not pick up the other thing that lay near it. "Water," Lila said. He took the canteen from the table and set it within her reach, and then stepped back the way he always did. She drank and set it down. The house eased back into itself, board by board. The wind moved across the tin roof and took some of the heat out of it. The telegraph wire out by the road gave a single note and then rested. The light in the doorway turned soft. The day leaned toward evening without asking anyone's permission. They cleaned first what could be cleaned. Caleb pulled the trap with the stick and folded its jaws shut. He wrapped it in burlap so the oil would not smear the door frame and hung it back on its peg. Lila swept straw in slow circles to chase the blood dark into one place. The stain did not argue. It let itself be taken up. When the pile held, Caleb brought a shovel and a burlap sack. He worked quiet. She kept the broom moving until the floor looked like a floor again. They stepped out into the long light. Behind the barn, the ground went to hardpan, and then to a strip of sand where floodwater had once hesitated. Caleb dug there. The dirt let the blade in. He tipped the straw into the hole, and the shovel made a soft sound when it covered the stain. Lila stood with the broom in her hand like a walking stick, and watched the last of it go dark and then go away. Caleb set the boot on the lip of the hole, looked at it with a still face, and nudged it in with the back of the shovel. He tamped the soil and left it with no marker. A breath of cool ran under the hot one, a small draft that came up the draw from the river and smelled faintly green. Clouds were stacked high to the west. They were the color of worn iron. Somewhere between them and here, a curtain of rain had come down thin and far too far to see the drops close enough to catch the nose as a promise. Lila shifted her weight. The leg held. Payne sat back from the edge and watched rather than reaching for her every time she moved. Caleb pulled a square of cloth from the inside pocket of his shirt. It was white once and had been washed until it went soft and thin and almost gray. There was a line of blue thread along one edge where a hand had practiced making neat. He held the cloth up where she could see it. "Use this for the stitches," he said. "It will keep the knots from biting." She took it and felt the life left in it from all the hands that had held it. She looked at the blue thread. May. He nodded. "It stays in the house. It is a good piece of cotton." She folded the cloth and slid it under the bandage to take pressure off the tender place. The relief was small and immediate. She breathed and let her eyes rest on the cottonwoods that marked the bend of the river and on the fence he had just set straight. She spoke without wanting to make a speech. People used to say it would be safe. Caleb leaned on the shovel and watched the sky. Saying is easy, staying is hard. A hawk turned slow above the mesa, tipping a wing holding the light in its feathers. The windmill clicked once and found a steady pace. The wire out by the road sang a thin note and fell quiet again. The chickens worked in the dust behind the house and left their funny algebra of prints. The sorrel shook and settled, with a noise from its chest that made the ground answer a little. They walked back toward the porch. Lila took the steps one by one and sat on the top board where she could see the yard and the pasture beyond. Caleb went inside and came back with a dipper and a tin plate. Beans, a thin slice of salt pork, a heel of bread. He put the plate where her hand could reach and sat 2 steps down with the dipper between his boots. He did not speak while she ate. He cut a small slice of pork with the knife he kept in his pocket and chewed it without hurry. She did not finish the bread. She broke the heel in 2 and set the smaller half on the plate. The taste held in her mouth and made her jaw ache in a way that meant she had eaten too fast. She took the dipper and drank and ran the back of her hand over her lips. The river taste lingered under the coffee taste. Her stomach let go of its not another inch. "We can see your fence from the south draw," she said. "We watched you mend it." Caleb kept his eyes on the pasture. "We." She let the word sit. There were more ears than eyes. He likes the sound a place makes when it is afraid. Caleb listened to the silence that followed. It was not empty. It had a shape. He put the dipper down and stood. He walked to the porch rail and looked at the flower dust that held their boot prints like photographs of motion. He read the marks without bending. A long stride here, a shorter one there where a body had crouched, a smear where recoil had driven a heel back. He took it in and stepped away to keep from scuffing them out. Inside, the cabin had settled. The lamps waited clean on the shelf. 3 kerosene cans sat in a neat row, their black paint dulled by use. The broom leaned where Lila had left it. The silver dollar in his pocket felt warm from the work. He touched it the way some men touch a rosary and then let it go. He gathered cloth for new bandages and set them on the table for later. He rinsed the bloody rag in a bucket until the water went pink and then clear. He carried the bucket to the cottonwoods and poured it slow so the roots would drink. On the far ridge, a figure sat a horse. It was a small thing in the light, but it leaned true in the saddle, a straight back that had learned drills. A long coat hung open dark blue, the kind of blue the army liked to make its own. The figure watched the place and turned the horse in a tight half circle and went off along the rim. Lila saw the shape, and then the coat, and then nothing. She did not say its name. Caleb looked at the ridge and saw only heat stacked like glass. Lila slid the May cloth a finger's width and found another small ease. She looked at the horse on the nail above the table through the open door. The carved letters were plain. The wood seemed to have taken on a sheen, a kind of hand shine, that comes when people touch the same place because it comforts them to do it. The sight put weight in her chest that was not heavy, just obvious. She spoke without turning her head. "You left space around me today. I noticed. I mean to keep to that," he said. "It does not cost me." "It costs," she said, and the word had two meanings in it. She set the empty plate to the side and leaned back against the post with caution. Her leg rested along the top step. The bandage stayed white under the new cloth. The breeze lifted the damp hair at her temple and left the skin cooler. Caleb stood at the edge of the porch and used the toe of his boot to clear a narrow channel in the dust, so rain would run off instead of pooling by the threshold. He worked the shallow line the length of the board and made a second line alongside the first. He hung the shovel on its nail and set the broom next to it. His hand went to a lantern and he trimmed the wick with a careful pinch, a habit that asked nothing of thought. The light leaned toward evening. The sky was a dirty silver, where the far rain made a curtain. Lightning lived inside those clouds, a dull flash that did not make a sound. The smell of wet earth grew stronger, the old smell that digs itself into memory and makes time fold. Lila closed her eyes for a count and opened them again. "I am tired of running," she said. "I am tired of waking with my jaw locked and my hands open like they forgot they can hold anything." Caleb did not turn. "You have hands," he said, not as comfort and not as correction, only as a thing he could say plain. She made a small sound that could have been a laugh, if a laugh did not have to climb over so much ground. She let the porch board take her weight. She watched her own toes and the tiny burr of a splinter that had worked into the wood fiber. She picked at it with a nail and then left it. Some things did not want to be pulled this minute. The sun put a burnished stripe on the river and then lost it as the wind changed. The cattle blew and put their heads down again, satisfied with grass and water. The sorrel flicked its tail. A quail called from the brush with the steady rhythm it always used. The wire sang again and then went still. Caleb took the plate and cup inside and set them in the washpan. He poured a dipper of water over the tin and scrubbed them with sand and rinsed them with another dipper. He set them to dry and wiped his hands on a towel. He looked over the table the way a person looks over a field he has planted. The cloths, the needle, the coil of thread, the matches in their dish, the lamps in a row, the cans below the pistol at the back corner of the table where it would sit until someone needed it. He stepped back to the door. Lila had her chin on her shoulder and her eyes on the west. The clouds held. The breeze came across the yard and moved the hair at her neck. The porch boards ticked. The day had not decided whether it wanted to hold heat or let it go. "You need anything?" he said. "Air," she said, and the porch had plenty of that. She breathed it in. She let it out slow. The house breathed with her wood and nail and tin roof, all of it taking the small work of evening into itself. The smell of rain stayed at the edge of things and waited for its time. Evening scratched the tin with light. The air shifted and carried a clean edge off the river. Lila opened her eyes to it and lifted herself with care. Caleb stood near the porch post with his hat brim low and his attention on the pasture where dust still hung in the dips like breath after running. He looked at the fence, the trough, the line of cottonwoods, the corners of the yard that are not corners until a man needs them to be. "We will work in the barn," he said, not loud. She nodded and took the broom handle. The steps felt steady under her heel and toe. Inside the barn, the air held the warmth of the day and the smell of hay that had sat a long time and turned sweet. Moted light cut through the slats and laid bars across the floor. The trap's peg was empty now. The peg beside it held a short length of chain with a hook meant for the windmill. Caleb took the chain down and felt the weight of it in his palm. Judged the swing, judged the bite of the hook. He set the chain high across the entry, where a man would come fast with his chin too proud. He stood on an upturned crate to reach and tested the give of the board. He tied a loop with a piece of mule rope and passed the chain through so one pull would bring it down with a whip at face height. He stepped back, imagined angles, stepped forward, shifted the knot, 2 fingers to one side. "Tell me your reach," he said. Lila raised her arms in front of the door to the mark he gave her. He watched where the hook would cut the air above her and made another small shift. He tied off the end in a quick half hitch and yanked to be sure it would not slip. The chain sang a short, hard note and fell quiet. He went to the shelf and set the lamps on the table. He drew a finger along the chimneys and left a clean line. He reached under the table for the kerosene cans and checked their caps. The threads were slick. The smell came up sharp and cold. He poured a thin measure into a dented tin and followed a path along the barn floor with a steady hand. The line ran from the big door in a slow curve to the interior and back along the edge of the stalls to a broken lantern he had placed near the far corner where the floor was clean enough to catch. Lila watched the dark stripe widen where the boards had drunk oil over the years. She took a burlap sack from the peg and shook red powder into it, the kind of powder people keep in kitchens and saddlebags for flavor and for flies. She walked to the opening and dusted the threshold with it, then sifted a thicker patch where a boot heel would plant for leverage. The powder rose in a small red cloud and then settled. The smell crawled into the nose and sat there hot and insistent. She straightened, with a hand on the jam. Eyes do not like this. They will not, he said. He took a moment and put chalk marks on the boards to show where not to step if you were in a hurry. Then he rubbed them out with his palm, so only he would remember. He went to the rack and lifted down 2 lengths of old harness leather. He fastened them to the inside of the door as grips so a person could pull the barn shut quick without showing too much of himself to the outside. Lila moved to the feed barrels and tipped one just enough to roll it 3 fingers to the left. She braced it with a wedge so it would not roll back. Blind behind it, she crouched and sighted through the crack until the pasture cut into view. She felt the press of boards at her shoulder and the ground cool through her skirt. She set the shotgun across her lap and laid the small pistol inside easy reach. Caleb fetched a canvas water bucket and put it within hand's length of the broken lantern, full as a hedge against a thing that runs too far. He looked at the tin of oil again and made a second line across the floor, not as thick a switchback that would confuse the first if someone tried to stamp it with a boot. He dragged a bale hook across the dirt to leave a false track pointed to the lean-to on the far side. They worked without saying much, the barn filled with the small sounds of work done right, a knot cinched and tested, a hinge eased with a drop of oil, a rope thrown over a beam and caught clean. He paused, once drew the silver dollar from his pocket, rubbed a thumb across its smooth face, and set it on the high shelf beside the lamps. It caught a last coin of sun and held it. Lila saw him set it there. She said nothing. She stood and felt the pull at her thigh and waited for the hurt to fade down to a quiet throb. She walked to the stall where the sorrel had been rubbed down and pressed her palm to the gelding's flank. The horse flicked an ear and breathed warm onto her wrist. She left her hand there a count and stepped away. "You should sleep an hour," Caleb said. "I will keep eyes on the edge." She shook her head and went to the cabin. Inside, she took the May cloth and checked at the bandage. Clean. She retied the knot so the pull would sit on new skin, then lowered the skirt, and took the pistol in hand for the feel of it. She sat on the bed for a breath and stood again. The window roll of light had narrowed on the floor. She could hear the faint voice of the wire on the road, a nervous line that never made a word. Back in the yard, Caleb cleaned the porch of flour dust, so only the tracks he wanted to read would show. He closed the house door to a narrow crack to keep light from making a target of the room. He set a lantern on the kitchen table and left it dark. He walked the yard once slow, to let his feet remember where the ground changed. He put his palm to the door of the chicken coop and felt the small feathered bodies move and settle inside. He went to the windmill and checked the pinch bolt on the tail. The blade turned and clicked and turned again. The sun slid lower and went red at the ribs. A faint noise reached across the flats from the east. So far a person might doubt it, if not for how the cattle responded, heads up in one motion and then quiet again. Lila came to the barn door with the shotgun at her side. She stood where the threshold made shade and looked at him with a question that did not need a long answer. "We hold," he said. She took her place by the slats and found her breath. He stepped to the porch and set the rifle on the rail. He took his hat off and hung it by the door the way he always did and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. He felt the day's grit under the skin at his wrist. He listened. A small flash winked on the mesa. Lila saw it between slats. He saw it from the porch. It did not last. He did not try to name it. He let the land bring things in order not quicker than it wanted. In the barn, the oil lay quiet in its lines. The broken lantern sat in its place glass, already cracked, so it would not argue when it was called to work. The chain waited above the door, with the hook turned like a question. The sack of powder held a last shake if a person needed to make the air mean. From her place, Lila watched the pasture take on that peculiar color between gold and gray that lives only for a short window in a long summer. The cottonwoods went dark at their centers and silver at the edges. The fence wires drew straight lines and then disappeared when she looked hard at them. She felt the bandage pull and settle. She tested the curl of her finger around the trigger and let it ease. Caleb's eyes made passes over the yard and back to the far draw where sage covered the ground in humps. He did not cling to any one spot. He let his gaze move like the slow sweep of a clock. He breathed so his shoulders stayed calm and the rifle learned the rhythm. He counted his rounds without moving his lips. He spoke without turning his head. When I call now, you break that lantern and throw it just past the first curve. Do not throw at the line. Throw past it. Let the floor do our work. I hear you, she said. If they push the door, pull the harness tight and give ground along the wall. Do not fight the door. Make it look easy for them and right for us. I hear you. If I fall, the water is there. She did not answer this time. Her hand brushed the canvas bucket, then the gun stock. The wood under her palm felt slick where other hands had made it so. She liked the weight of it and the way the barrel settled when she did. She eased a breath out through her teeth and found the same breath coming back in through her nose without hitch. The first bat of the night dipped out of the cottonwoods and went ragged in the air. The windmill turned slow, then steadied. The wire hummed and went silent. Dust lifted in a low run along the far draw and then fell flat again. Caleb's jaw worked once and went still. He stood the way a post stands, and yet you could see he would move the inch he needed at the right second. Lila thought of a bedroll that had smelled of cedar once, and of a night that had not asked anything of her lungs. She put the thought away and set herself in the present with the sound of her own legs in her ears and the tiny click of the action when she slid it back and forth to be sure it would not stick. The chain above the door hung quiet. The oil line sat in a dark curve on the floor like a sleeping snake. Caleb looked into the barn and then back to the field. He lifted the silver dollar off the shelf with a long reach and tucked it back into his pocket without thinking. He checked the sky as if it could tell him a time he could use. The light thinned another degree. He put his cheek to the rifle stock until it found the old worn hollow and stayed there. He took one more drink from the canteen and sent 2 drops into the dust for the ground to hold. They were ready in the only way people get ready when a place and its pieces have been arranged by hand. The yard held a new shape if you knew where to look. The barn did too. The air cooled and set the hair along Lila's forearm standing. She did not rub it down. Caleb shifted his boots until the ground felt like it had his weight at the way it should. The lamplight within the house did not show. The porch boards did not creak. The night eased a foot onto the yard like a man testing a bridge. The cattle muttered. The river sent up a cool breath. The wind turned in the cottonwoods and left them whispering to each other. The chain waited. The oil waited. The hooks and grips on mines waited. The sound came first as a low tide of hooves, then the open filled with men. 6, at least maybe more, behind the rise riding loose and high with dust rolling at their knees. Laughter came across the pasture in torn strips. The cattle broke and ran. The wire shivered where a steer brushed it and kept its shape. Caleb let the breath he had been holding go quiet. He lifted the rifle to the rail and settled the stock where it liked to live. Lila eased deeper into shadow and felt for the broken lantern with her free hand. The oil line waited on the floor in its black curve. The chain above the door was a dark snake coiled clean against the beam. Silas Crane came to the middle of the yard and stopped his mare with a finger on the rein. His hat rode low. The pale scar on his cheek caught light and threw it back. He looked at the house at the barn at the fence. He smiled without showing teeth. "Afternoon Rourke," he called. "The place got prettier, but I do not suppose it got braver." Caleb did not answer. He set the bead at the place where a man's belt meets his ribs. He did not take the shot. He watched the others. 2 peeled off, left 2 right. One stayed near Silas with his hand near his thigh, the way a pup stands by an older dog and hopes to be seen. Lila raised the shotgun until the sight met the slice of yard she could hold. Her breath went steady and stayed. The red powder she had sifted at the threshold had settled in the cracks of the boards. She could smell it even over oil and straw, a hot spice that told the nose a story all by itself. Silas nodded to the riders on the right. "Walk it in," he said. "Make it simple." They came at the barn, low reins held close. One slipped wide for the back corner. The other aimed for the door with his eyes on shadow. Boots hit dirt. Horses veered and went long to keep clear. The first man hit the threshold and blinked against the spice. He swore. He took one more step blind into the curve of oil. Now, Caleb said. Lila smashed the lantern against the edge of a stall and threw what was left of it past the first bend. The wick found the line and took hold at once. Fire ran like a thing with long legs. It climbed the trail Caleb had laid and then doubled back on the second line, a bright forked tongue that learned the floor in heartbeats. The man at the door staggered and swiped at his face. The red powder had got in his eyes and his mouth. His hands were wet with tears he did not mean to make. He stumbled into fire. It did not know him and did not care. He fell sideways with a cry that sounded like a word and was not a word. The second man swung for the chain to pull the door wide and took the hook across his cheek. The sound was meat and metal together. He reeled back with his hand to his face and came forward again, because men who do this kind of work come forward, or they do not come at all. Lila let the bead find his ribs and pulled the trigger. The shot hit where a heart lives when a man turns. He folded like wheat. A breath broke out of him and did not return. Outside, Caleb pinned the man who moved on Silas's left with a shot that cut the rein and took the hand near it. The horse sprang and spun and dragged the rider 2 steps before he let go. The yard filled with ash and noise. Men shouted to be heard over the crack and suck of flame. The mare under Silas planted and tried to back. He cooed to her once and put his heels in. He leaned to put a bullet at the porch. The splinters leaped from the rail and fell straight down. The fire ran along the board seam like it had maps. It rounded the stall and climbed a wall to find new feed in the spiderwork of old straw. Heat hit Lila's face in a slap and then in a steady press. The hair on her cheek crisped and curled. Smoke slid low across the floor and then rose in a twist. She coughed and stayed where she was until the next shape presented itself. The man who had gone for the back corner stepped through the side gap and reached for her from the blind side. He grabbed cloth and skin and pulled. She dropped the shotgun, took the pistol by feel, and drove the butt hard into his ribs to turn him. He made a noise like air leaving a bellows. She put the barrel under his arm and squeezed once. The pistol bucked in her hand. He went soft and heavy against her. She shoved him off with all the strength she had and backed along the wall skirt still tied to keep from catching. Hold, Caleb called from the yard. His rifle spoke again. A horse screamed and kicked against its own shadow. One rider threw himself off and crawled for an angle behind the trough. Caleb shot the trough rim where a hand would come for it. Wood spit a chip that cut the man along the knuckles. He jerked them back like a scalded child. Silas took in the picture in quick bites. Fire in the barn, 2 down in the yard, smoke at the eaves. He lifted his pistol and put a careful shot through the window of the cabin to test for bodies. The glass burst outward and fell in small stars. Dust puffed from the curtain and drifted. He smiled a little bigger and signaled with his chin to the pair holding back on the left to come fast. In the barn, the hook chain swung slow and smoked at the clean metal. Lila scooped the shotgun and racked it by feel. She could not see the far corner now. Fire stacked itself there and roared where air fed it. The bale hook Caleb had dragged for a false track lay bright in the light before smoke took it. The oil on the second line found a dry board and climbed the wall in a fresh lick. Caleb ran a count in his head and stepped off the porch to cut angle. He felt the heat come out of the barn and sweep across the yard like a wind that hurts. He put the next bullet into the dirt in front of a horse to send it sideways and break the line. The animal slid and caught itself. The rider grabbed for mane and lost the choice of what came next. Caleb sent a second shot to take the rifle from his hands. Wood splintered and the rifle spun away. From the far side of the barn, a figure lunged through smoke and flame and took 3 steps before the air taught him a new lesson. He staggered, slapped at his shirt where a spark had found it, and fell to his knees. Lila took the breath she needed and shot him in the shoulder so he would not rise into her again. He went down flat and stayed with the fire at his back. She moved to the bucket and threw water in a fan to keep the oil line from slipping past the curve she and Caleb had agreed on. Steam shot up and made a hiss like a snake. The air went hotter for the second the steam lived. Then it came away and carried a smell that was part iron and part fat and part old wood. Silas pressed his mare around for a better view. He found Caleb by the trough with the rifle steady and the eyes that did not change much no matter the noise. He lifted his pistol and let a shot go to see how the man would break. Caleb did not. He crossed 2 steps to his right and fired at the edge of Silas's boot where metal and leather meet. The mare reared and boxed the air. Silas sat deep and cursed without heat. Back, he said to his men, and one obeyed, dragging another by the collar. The last one on the left rushed the barn door in a stupid rush and went blind on the powder in the air. He hit the board hard with his shoulder, found the harness strap by accident, and pulled the door halfway shut before his foot slipped and his weight ran him across the oil. Fire took his pant leg and climbed. He rolled in the dirt and put his hands to his leg and rolled again. Lila could smell hair burn and hear him bite his own mouth. Caleb saw the pull on the harness and moved in to finish the closure. He caught the leather with fingers that knew what work feels like and heaved. The door came against the jamb in a grunt, and the gap narrowed to the width of a hand. Flame banged against wood and searched the seam. Smoke poured along the rafters and tried to live there. The chain above the door sang in the new heat and dropped a bright scale on the dirt. Inside the barn, the air had edges. Lila kept low and let heat stack where it wanted near the roof. Her eyes watered and cleared and watered again. She felt her way along the wall, counting boards, keeping skin off the glowing nail heads. She reached the small back window Caleb had pointed to when they set the second line. It was a square just big enough for a person who decided small places were not the worst. She kicked the latch with the side of her foot and shoved the window up. Fresh air came in like a hand on the back of her neck. She put the shotgun through, then her shoulders, then planted her palms in dirt and pulled her hips and legs after. The bandage pulled loose on one edge. She did not stop to fix it. Caleb stepped to that corner, as if the ground had told him. He saw her shoulder and caught the back of her dress at the seam below the neck, to guide, not to claim. She slid free. Her hair smelled of smoke and singe. He put his body between her and the yard for the breath it took to get her on her knees. She took the shotgun from the ground and rolled to sight along the windowsill. A rider tried to use the smoke as cover and came on at a half crouch. She shot him center, and he sat down like someone had pulled a chair from under him and changed his mind. Silas watched a moment longer than was wise, and let his eyes say what his mouth would not. He turned the mare with a hard tug and kicked her off the line of fire. The others followed his motion, because men follow things that move first. They ran wide of the white fence and took the low place that leads to the draw. The yard held their dust until the wind found it and sent it to the cottonwoods. Caleb did not chase with bullets. He listened hard until the last hoofbeat turned into something that could have been anything. He went for the barn door and set his shoulder to it. The heat punched him in the face and chest. The fire had found the old straw stacked against the far wall and built itself tall there. He grabbed the water bucket and sent it at the base of the curve to cut the path toward the tack hooks. Lila brought the second bucket from the corner and did the same on the other side. Steam blew and came back on them. He coughed until his ribs bit. She pressed her mouth into the crook of her arm and breathed through cloth. They worked the edges. The center would have to live or die on its own. Flames crawled along the stall board and dropped when the water hit them in the right place. They rose again 2 feet over as if insulted. Caleb used the shovel to throw damp earth at the seam where wall meets floor. He made a line of wet against a line of fire. It held for a count of 5 and then did not. He made it again. Lila saw a saddle blanket begin to smoke on a peg and knocked it down with the shotgun barrel. She stamped it with her boot until it went dark. She moved to the beam where the harness straps hung and soaked them before heat could teach them a new shape. Her hands were red at the knuckles. Her face wore ash in little commas. When the air told her to get low, she got low. When it told her to stand, she stood. She kept the work inside the body and did not let the head decide for it. The roof did not catch. The post near the door blackened and stopped there. The far wall gave up a plank into flame and then ran out of food where the dirt had been damp in spring. The bright center that had built itself around dry hay found less to drink and began to complain about that. The roar shrank to a thick talk. The thick talk fell to a hiss. Steam drifted white and sweet into the dusk. Caleb stepped out of the door and set himself on his heels in the yard with his palms on his knees. He did not speak. Lila came out behind him and sat on the ground with her back to the porch step. She tipped her head down and held it there. Smoke rose from the barn in a soft rope. The wind took it and laid it along the ground toward the draw. The yard had a new layer of black on it where the door had breathed. He looked at her, not long, just long enough to mark how she sat and what color her lips had become. He reached for the canteen, shook it to hear what was left, and set it by her hand without letting his fingers touch her skin. She drank. A drip of water went down her chin and made a clean track through soot. They sat until the breath found them both. Chickens began their small talk again. A calf bawled and then heard its mother, and quieted. The windmill turned. The wire out by the road hummed a single note and stopped. The barn stood with one side gone to charcoal and the other side wet as a river rock. The chain at the door hung black and clean. The hook had a smear of something on it that would not come off. Lila pulled the bandage straight under the Maycloth and tied the knot again with fingers that did not shake. Caleb picked up a fallen lamp chimney and turned it in his hand to see the crack the heat had made. He set it down on the porch rail and wiped his palm on his pant leg. He went to the door and touched the jamb where fire had licked it and then spared it. They did not speak for a while. The light thinned to near dark. The cabin showed a square of shadow where glass had been. The pasture had found its old order except for boot prints that pointed all ways at once. Caleb stood and rolled his shoulders once to put them back where they belonged. Lila pushed up from the ground with a hand on the step and steadied until her leg agreed. He nodded once toward the barn. She looked and nodded back. The place had changed shape. It was still a place that could hold them. They worked the barn until the steam thinned and the hiss went to nothing. Caleb used the shovel to break the black crust where boards had blistered. Lila carried wet burlap and laid it over places that still breathed heat. The smell had changed. It was no longer raw flame. It was wet ash oil gone to ghost old straw turned to a sweet that had a bitter end. The half that burned was a clean ruin. The half that held stood striped with smoke. A saddle blanket lay in a corner, beaten into an ugly shape by her boot. Caleb lifted it and hung it on a peg that had not darkened. He found the bale hook and tossed it into dirt to cool. The chain at the door glowed dull where it had taken the heat. The hook wore a smear that would not wash. In the yard, 2 men lay where the fight had put them. One had met the chain and then the shot. One had reached into smoke and come out of it for 3 steps. They looked small under open sky. Caleb fetched canvas from the lean-to and cut it true with a knife he kept sharp. Lila held the edges as he rolled the bodies and tied the corners. They carried each bundle to the patch of hardpan behind the barn and set them down with care that was not ceremony. The canvas rasped against their hands. The wind smelled of damp earth off the river and creosote from the fence posts. "Here," Caleb said. He drove the shovel into ground that had learned to be stubborn. It gave underweight and steadiness. Lila leaned on the broom handle while he worked and stepped in once to take a turn. The stitches pulled, then settled. She lifted the dirt with small bites and gave the shovel back. He dug the rest until the hole had the shape it needed. They slid the first bundle in. The canvas brushed the side and left a dark line. Lila stood with her hand on her thigh and watched without blinking. He lowered the second and set it so the weight lay flat. He pulled soil over them. The sound of it was soft and steady. He tamped the top with the back of the shovel and smoothed it with the blade. No marker. The yucca beyond made small rattles at the tips where dried blooms held on. A light breeze came up and moved the smoke along the ground. The chickens had settled on their roosts and murmured in patient tones. The cattle in the pasture had found grass again and made the low rhythm that cows make when danger is not in their mouths. They went back to the house. Caleb set the shovel by its nail. He rinsed his hands at the barrel and the water ran gray into the wash tub. He rolled his sleeves higher. When he leaned to scoop another dipper, something small flashed and clinked on the porch board. The silver dollar had slipped from his pocket and spun in a small circle that died on its edge. Lila bent and took it up. The coin was warm. The center was worn smooth from a long worry. She looked at it a heartbeat, then put it in his palm. Her voice was plain. "Do not drop it again." He closed his fingers on it and nodded. He did not thank her. He did not need to. He slid it into a deeper pocket and tested the seam with his thumb to be sure it would hold. Inside the cabin, the air had a clean edge from the night that was beginning. Glass lay on the floor beneath the window. He swept it into a small circle and lifted it with the dustpan into a bucket. Lila folded clean cloth and set it on the table. She untied the bandage and slipped the square of cotton that had belonged to May into a new position to ease the pull. She washed her hands at the basin on the stoop and watched the water go cloudy, then clear. Caleb checked the lamps. One chimney had cracked fine as a hair. He left it dark and set another on the table. He lifted the cap, trimmed the wick, filled it 2 fingers deep, and lit it. The flame stood small and sure. He pinched the cap back into place and carried the lamp to the porch post. He hung it from the hook so the light fell onto the steps in a soft circle and did not show the room beyond. They returned to the barn with buckets to walk the line again. Embers glowed in the seam where a plank met an old brace. Caleb used the shovel to lift the bright bits into a metal pan. Lila followed with water and sand. They worked until the glowing spots went to dull and then to nothing. The roof frame held. The south wall wore a black quilt that would not come off. The door still swung. He tested the hinge. It groaned and then remembered the work and settled into it. On the ridge, a horse and rider paused. The coat was a dark blue that had known a tailor and a quartermaster. The figure sat quiet and took in the yard. The porch lamp, the line of smoke still creeping. The horse flicked its ears. The rider turned the animal and drifted along the silhouette of the mesa until both were a shape, then a thought, then gone. Lila found the small window at the back of the barn and propped it open with a scrap of wood so the heat could leave. She set the shotgun on the workbench and cleaned the soot off the barrel with a dry rag. Her hands did not shake now. Her cheeks wore smoke in faint arcs where tears had made lines when the heat had pressed her eyes. Caleb lifted a wet sack and swabbed the porch rail where splinters had spit. He looked through the broken window and saw the table clean and the whittled horse still on its nail. He touched the edge of the frame and felt grit under his fingertip. He went inside and cleared the glass from the floor where feet would find it. He carried the bucket out and poured the glass into a hole near the cottonwoods and kicked some dirt over it. They sat on the steps when the chores let them. The porch boards were cool. The lamp made a warm circle that showed dust floating like tiny, slow snow. Beyond that circle, the yard was a deeper dark. The windmill turned enough to talk in little clicks. Somewhere a nightbird called 3 notes and stopped. Lila took the canteen and drank and set it between them. "I can sleep here," she said, and meant the porch where air moved. Caleb nodded. He brought a quilt and set it by her knee. He did not offer to spread it. She shook it once and let it fall over her legs. The stitched pieces caught the lamplight and showed a pattern that did not belong to him. He went to the barn door and looked in one last time. The embers had gone to gray. The new black on the wall had a sheen like river rock when it dries. He closed the door to a soft latch and came back to the steps. He sat 2 boards down and to the side and rested his forearms on his knees. The night carried the river to them in a cool thread. Frogs spoke and fell quiet. The air held the taste of ash and of something clean under it. The lamp chimed once as the wick shifted, then steadied. Lila's breathing evened. Caleb looked at the yard until it turned into a shape without edges, and then he let his eyes close. The house and the barn and the slope to the river all breathed together. The light on the porch stayed small and did its work. The dust settled where it chose and held there. Morning came up pale and careful. The porch boards were cool under Lila's bare feet. The lamp by the post still threw a small gold circle that faded as the light grew. Smoke hung low in the yard like a thought that had not moved on. The river sent a clean breath across the cottonwoods and brought the smell of wet bark. Caleb stepped off the porch with a hammer and a pocket of nails. He set a shoulder into the barn door and felt the hinge answer. The half that had burned wore a black skin with a faint gloss. The half that held stood gray and honest. He laid his palm flat to a charred post to see if it still breathed heat. It did not. He nodded once and set the nail between his teeth. They did not speak much while they worked. He braced a new board against the scorched frame and drove nails in clean. The hammer rang. Sawdust curled at his boots and took to the breeze. Lila hauled buckets and set them where a hand might need water without asking. She lifted the bale hook to a new peg and tested its swing. The rhythm of work wrote itself into the morning. He cut lengths of lumber, and the saw sang as it bit. Resin bled in clear lines and gathered grit. He handed her small jobs without stepping into her space. She checked the gate latch and filed the burr off the catch so it would not bite the hand that closed it. She swept ash to the side and found the floor under it. The broom left light lines in the gray that the wind took away. When the sun climbed high enough to heat the metal on the saw, they went to the cabin. Coffee waited in the pot. He poured her a cup and cut it with water so it would not kick too hard. He set the cup on the table and watched her hand find it on its own. She drank and put the cup down and left her palm on the warm tin like a person warming a stone on a cold day. He took his own cup out to the porch and stood with his back to the post and watched the cattle decide the fence was still true. Inside, she found clean cloth and checked the bandage. The stitches held. The square of cotton that had belonged to May had taken on the shape of her thigh and held that shape even off the body. She slid it a finger's width to teach her skin a new line of pressure. She folded the quilt and set it neat at the foot of the bed, without thinking about why that mattered. The yard had a new sound. He had set the windmill right, and now it clicked gentle instead of complaining. He hammered a brace across the inside of the barn wall and stood back to read the frame. He put his hand out and stopped it above the blackened section without touching. Lila came to the doorway and stood in the shade and watched his back speak the language of work. At noon, a thin cloud slid across the sun and made the color of the yard go flat. He leaned the hammer against the post and went to the fence. A strand of wire had loosened where a steer had tested it in the night. He reached to pull the staple free and found a stiff card tucked under it. The back was clean white with tiny blue diamonds. On the face, someone had drawn a single letter in ink that had bled a little at the edges. R. He turned the card over and put it back under the staple and pressed the wire tight with his thumb. He looked along the fence and then across the pasture and then at the mesa where heat made the shape of a rider if a man wanted it to. He said nothing. He slipped the basic card into his pocket and did not take the silver coin out to sit with it. Lila picked beans out of the pot with a spoon and laid them onto a plate. He ate standing 1 foot on the step and kept his eyes on the yard. When she went to the line by the shed with a basket of wet cloth, she hummed a tune without words. It climbed and fell like a small road between hills. He stopped the hammer in his hand and listened with his head a little to one side as if trying to hear something far off. He started the hammer again and kept the rhythm under the tune, so it felt like a part of it. The day lengthened and softened at the edges. He planed a rough board, and shavings fell in long curls that looked like pale ribbons. She shook the quilt once and let it breathe over the line. The cloth snapped and settled and made that sound clean cotton makes when it is almost dry. The breeze turned and brought the river again. It carried the sound of frogs even in daylight. At the table she pulled the pistol apart and wiped the soot from its frame with a patch and a little oil. The action clicked in small steps. She checked the cylinder with a fingertip. She put the pistol back together and slid it into the space beneath a folded shirt on the shelf where her hand would find it without looking. He watched the shape of her do that from the doorway and then went back to the barn. By late afternoon, the rebuilt wall held its own weight. He tested the brace and the brace held him. He stepped back and let the place tell him what needed him next. He fetched a bucket and washed the mud that had dried around the porch steps into low arcs that dried white. He reset the broken window with a patch of board cut to size. The cabin looked different with wood where glass had been. It did not look wrong. The sun slid toward the mesa. Lila set the last cloth on the line and wiped her hands on her skirt. She stood with her face turned to the wind as if to learn it. He came and stood near enough that each could see the other if they turned without making a point of turning. "Do we ever stop being broken?" she said, her eyes still on the cottonwoods. He worked his jaw once as if putting words in their place. "No." She waited. "We learn what to do with it," he said. "We make it useful." She nodded like the answer was one she had expected and could carry. He brought a small plate with a thin slice of pork and set it on the porch rail. She did not move for a count and then reached for it and ate with calm teeth. He raised the lamp by the post with a thumb to the hook and brought the wick up a hair. The light warmed the steps and made old nail heads shine. Later near dusk, he walked the fence again and pressed on the staples to be sure the wire sat true. His fingers found the place where the card had been. He could feel the ghost of its stiffness still. He turned and looked at the cottonwoods and the line of the road and the telegraph wire that cut the sky as if someone had drawn a rule there. It hummed once and fell quiet. Lila brought the quilt from the line and folded it while it was still warm from the day. She carried it inside and set it in its spot. She tied back her hair with a strip of cloth and wiped the soot ring from the rim of the kettle. Her lips moved in a tune without sound. She caught herself doing it and stopped and looked at her own hands with a kind of surprise that did not hurt. He came in and set his hat on the chair. He put the card on the table without turning it face up and put the silver coin next to it. He looked at both and then at her. She looked at the coin and then at him. Neither touched either. The light outside turned slow and darkened toward blue. The windmill clicked and then found that gentle pace again. The river carried a cool smell over the yard and under the roof and into the corners. The cattle worked at the grass and lowered their heads and forgot about fences for a while. The lamp on the porch drew a few small moths and they beat their wings against the glass without learning. He trimmed the wick a fraction and the flame steadied. She stood at the doorway and looked out at what was theirs to look at. He leaned against the post and let the weight come off his back a little. Between them, the table held a coin that was worn smooth and a card with a single letter that was not worn at all. The house breathed. The barn breathed. The land breathed with them. The night began to gather in the cottonwoods, and it felt like a thing you could share. Dawn lifted the yard in soft gray. Cottonwoods showed their pale undersides and then turned green as the light grew. The river sent a clean breath through the grass. Lila stepped onto the porch and let the boards take her weight. The night's cool still held in the wood. Her leg tested each step and gave back a quiet yes. Inside, Caleb set the kettle near the coals and coaxed flame. He ran a thumb along the edge of the patched window to feel the fit. The glass had been wood last night. The wood sat square now, planed smooth, no splinters to catch a sleeve. On the table lay the silver dollar and the playing card with the blue diamonds. He picked up the coin. It was warm already. He turned it once in his palm and slipped it deep into his pocket. He left the card where it was. Steam lifted, coffee went into the pot. He poured one cup and cut it with water. He set it on the porch rail where her hand could find it. She took a small sip and held the heat in her mouth before she swallowed. Her shoulders eased a little. She set the cup down, reached across the table, and took the card. The letter sat black and simple in the middle. R. The ink had bled at the edge of each stroke, as if it had tried to travel and learned it could not. She slid the card into the pocket of her skirt and closed the button. She looked toward the cottonwoods. He watched her look and then followed it. They walked the path to the river with the kind of pace that keeps the breath even. Sand gave under their boots near the bend. A heron lifted out of the reeds with legs trailing and the sound of slow wings. The pecos ran low and brown in the shade green where it caught sky. Willow roots knuckled the bank. Water talked small against them. Lila sat on a fallen trunk and let her bare feet find the cool. She rolled the card once between her fingers and held it over the current. "It has had enough of us," she said. The river took it as soon as it left her hand. The card tilted, caught a curl, flipped, and went face down. It slid past the roots, past a sunken stick, found the slow run in the middle, and moved on until it was a pale square and then only a shine. Caleb knelt and washed glass grit from his palms that he had missed last night. Red dust lifted from the lines around his wrist and bled into the brown water as a small cloud that went thin and then disappeared. He bent forward and wet his hair. He stood and let the drops fall off his chin. He looked at her and then away so she could rinse without the weight of his eyes. She cupped water over her face, over the line where smoke had marked her. Her skin came up pink and clean. She brushed damp hair back and drew the May cotton square from her pocket to pat the bandage and tuck it neat again. The cloth had taken on a curve from her thigh. She nodded to herself at the fit and returned it. They stood there for a while with the sound of the river in their ears. A frog called once. Leaves talked above them. The day put light on the mesa, the way iron takes heat and keeps it. When they turned for the house, their footprints showed in the damp sand and then faded when wind came up the draw. Back in the yard, the sorrel shook and tossed its head and walked the fence to check its world. Caleb ran a hand along the neck without looking at his hand. He pulled a new staple from his pocket and set it with 2 sure taps where the wire had a mind to lift. The windmill turned slow and did not complain. The barn door moved on its hinge with a dull sound where black had sealed into grain. He set a shoulder to it and felt how it would behave. It obeyed. Lila fetched the quilt from the bed and carried it outside to the rail for the sun to warm. She stood with her hands flat on it and watched the stitches catch light. She hummed. It was the tune she had used yesterday, but softer, like a thing you repeat only to find out if it still belongs to you. Caleb worked the latch on the gate and let the sound of it drop into the morning. He listened to her humming without moving his head. They set about small tasks. He planed a thin strip for the window trim and finished it with sand. She swept the porch in long strokes and lifted the dust into low spirals. The broom made tracks in ash the wind had left on the edges. She wiped the soot ring off the stovepipe with a damp rag until it shone dull. He rinsed the coffee pot and set it upside down to drip on the step. Their talk ran short and clear when it came. "You should not carry weight alone," she said, eyes on the barn wall. "I will take the half I know," he said. "You tell me the shape of the rest." She looked at her hands and then at the river line. "I will tell you when it is inside my mouth and not my throat." "All right." He went inside and came back with the porch lamp in both hands. He checked the cap and the wick. He wiped the glass with a clean corner of his shirt and held it to the light to read the smear. He hooked it under the roof beam above the steps where the wood had been rubbed smooth by years of hands. The lamp hung there unlit for now, small and sure in the morning. At midday, they walked to the hard pan behind the barn and stood a little apart. The dirt had settled flat over the 2 bundles they had put into it. No marker. Yucca rattled at the edge where the wind touched its dry bells. Lila crouched and pressed her fingers once to the surface, the way a person tests bread and knows if it took. She stood without a word. He adjusted his hat brim and looked at the line where the grave met the living ground, and then looked away. In the cabin, she folded the quilt and set it back in its place. She wiped the table with a damp cloth and set the 2 tin cups side by side. The carved mesquite horse moved when the door opened and settled again. She touched its flank with one finger and took her hand away. Afternoon laid gold on the grass and put long shadows under the cottonwoods. A ribbon of air came off the river and moved across the yard. Caleb stood with his hands on the porch rail and read the pasture the way a man reads the sky. He was not looking for a shape. He was looking so the land knew it had his eyes. Lila sat on the top step and rested her chin on her knees. Her hair dried in sun and went soft again. He drew the coin from his pocket and turned it. The center shone like a path worn into stone. He set it on the porch table near the lamp's base where his thumb could find it when he came and went. He did not put it back in his pocket. He let it belong to the place. The light gentled. Moths found the shaded corners under the roof. A quail called from the brush at the fence line. Somewhere far off, a train put a low sound into the air and kept it there. The telegraph wire sang its thin answer and went still. Lila stood and carried the lamp's match tin to him. He took one, struck it along the sole of his boot, and waited until the flame steadied. He raised the chimney and touched fire to the wick. The lamp took the light the way good lamps do without fuss. He lowered the glass and turned the key until the flame stood small and clear. They ate at the table in quiet. Beans, a little pork, a heel of bread. He poured coffee, and she cut it with water. The warm smell filled the room and ran out the door. She set his cup near his hand without reaching across him. He set hers within reach and did not watch her take it. Their elbows made two brief shadows when they lifted their cups and then set them down. The yard went to blue. The lamp drew a small circle that reached the bottom step. Dust hung in it and turned slow. Lila carried her chair to the threshold and rested her heel on the next board down. Caleb leaned on the post with his shoulder, then shifted so wood would not hold a single spot too long. He breathed slow and felt the ribs give and take. She breathed with him without choosing to. "I am staying," she said. "No more words than that." He nodded. "There is room." They did not shake on it. They did not mark it with a word the size of a fence post. They let it sit in the air and settle the way the lamp's light settled into the boards and stayed there. She drew the quilt over her knees and looked toward the river. He set his hat on the chair and touched the silver dollar on the table once with his thumb and left it. The night found its shape. The cottonwoods whispered. The windmill clicked and rested and clicked again. The porch lamp burned steady under the eave and made a warm eye on the yard. The red dust in their boot seams would come out slow over days, and not all at once. The river moved over stones and did not argue. The house breathed. The barn breathed. They sat where they were and let the place hold them. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.